Well, welcome everyone to Conversations on Retail. We're so excited to be back with our friend Steve Blair to continue his series focusing on leadership and culture. My name is Matt Pfeiffer, the founder and CEO of Conversations on Retail. Just a couple of housekeeping issues before we get started today. First of all, we want to thank so much our sponsor of this series, Cameron Smith and Associates, long-term friends of mine. Knew Cameron Smith for a very long time. He was a friend and actually an investor in my very first company. So it's exciting to me to see Scott Crossett and the team at Cameron Smith and Associates come along as sponsors. The second thing we want to say is that this series is intended to be very interactive. This is not a podcast. This is not a perfectly choreographed discussion that we're going to record and just push out. The folks that are joining us live, we want you to participate. So if you've got questions while Steve is facilitating this conversation today, we hope that you'll click the Q&A button and submit your question in writing. And as Steve sees them or as he asks for them, we will get to those. Now, the other thing we're going to do this sort of fun is at the very end of the conversation, assuming that there's time, we're going to thank everyone and we're going to wrap up and we're going to stop recording. And then anyone that wants to stick around and then click raise hand, we will open up the microphones and let you all participate in just sort of this open conversation in the last couple of minutes. So again, we're so excited that you're here. We hope that you'll join the conveation. And Steve, I'm going to turn it over to you.
I have had the honor and privilege most of my career to work with and for some leaders that are growing and scaling organizations that care a ton about culture. They get it. They understand the importance of culture on attracting and retaining the best talent. And I'm excited to have conversations like this with leaders that are doing that in their respective fields. I have actually launched an advisory practice where I'm trying to come alongside leaders of those kinds of organizations and really help them understand kind of what their brand, their employment brand is, and how they can make sure that that gets communicated in a way to attract the talent, and then that they can live that out through a healthy culture and in a thriving organization. And so that's my personal passion. That's what drove us to start this conversation on leadership and culture initiative. And so I'm just excited to be able to get to have conversations with leaders that I admire and respect. And as the title suggests, this is a conversation. We're going to be talking with a leader today, and a lot of these topics or a lot of these leaders may come from the CPG industry or around the CPG industry. That's my background. Not all guests will be in that realm, but today is no exception. We have a founder of a CPG company, a 9-figure CPG company, on the call with us today, and I'm just excited for you to get to meet Mike Beckham and learn a little more about Simple Modern and the culture that they have. You know, I was exposed to Simple Modern probably 7 years ago in my early days at the Harvest Group, and got to know them at that point and have followed them and kept conversations going with them over the years. And so I'm excited for you to get a chance to hear from Mike. If you're wondering, and I'm not sure how you could be, but if you're wondering about Simple Modern and what they are, I'll just direct you to that one drawer in your kitchen that will not close all the way because you have so many tumblers in that drawer from your kids and your spouse that have been buying amazing tumblers over the last few years. You're going to find some Simple Modern tumblers in that drawer. Simple Modern is the leader in insulated drinkware. And they got great designs, great brands, great performance. There's a viral video going around right now of their performance versus the new Stanley tumbler that's out there. So I'm excited to have a friend of leadership and culture, a distant friend of mine in terms of we never had a chance to shake hands in real life, but we've certainly talked back and forth on social media and whatnot. Mike Beckham, Simple Modern, welcome to today's conversation.
Hey, Steve, thanks for having me.
I tell you, as I've told you beforehand, I set out on this little adventure with Matt, and I had a handful of leaders in mind that I wanted to chat with. And man, I am just blessed to be 6 for 6 right now with having those 6 leaders that were the first 6 on my list join us for these conversations. And you are certainly in that group just because of not only the story of Simple Modern, but the side seat I have had to Chris and others as they have really, really poured into the culture under your leadership. Man, it's just a great story. So I'm excited for us to get into it with you today. First, though, I mean, you're an entrepreneur. This is not your first entrepreneurial journey, but your career started in an organization that I would not necessarily describe as entrepreneurial, and that's Crew. Can you tell us a little bit first about your journey from Crew into entrepreneurship?
Yeah, so I was a finance major in college, and I very unexpectedly went into the nonprofit world right out of college. My wife, I got married a week after I graduated, and my wife was finishing a master's in accounting. So she was still going to be around the campus. And I thought, if we're going to be around the campus, maybe it makes sense for me to do something, local. There was an opportunity for me to be involved in a 1-year kind of internship with the ministry of Crew. And I'd had my life really impacted spiritually in college. So I thought this could be a great 1-year thing. And then I'll go into the marketplace. And what happened really was that 1 year turned into 2, turned into 10. And I spent my entire 20s really mentoring and teaching and investing in the lives of college students, which it's funny, when you're a college student, you think about your future as this kind of linear thing where you need to make the right decisions and you've got to be climbing and, progressing. And if you wanted to be where I'm at 43, I don't think you would ever say, well, hey, the first thing you should do is go and, raise your own salary and work at a nonprofit for 10 years.
Spend a decade in nonprofits.
Exactly. It's not a linear career path. But ironically, it's funny you mention it because it doesn't seem like you would think about ministry as a very entrepreneurial thing. But what I have found is it actually was the foundation of a lot of the critical, I would say, skill sets and thought processes that I needed to be a successful entrepreneur. One was that you really do have to learn to persuade and to sell. And that's just a core entrepreneurship. If you can't sell, if you can't persuade other people, you're going to have a rough go of it if you try and start a company, whether that's recruiting other people to your team or convincing people that your product that they've never heard of is something that they should try. But I think it also was really instrumental in me and my wife's lives of establishing what we wanted our life to be about and what was going to be the central worldview that predominated the decisions we made, the way that we used our time, the way that we, our marriage looked, the way that we raised kids, all of those things, that in our 20s, we were able to really solidify those things. So the way I would describe it is by the time I got to 30 and when I ended up going into the business world, I had probably a clearer sense of who I was and what I felt like my purpose was, the kind of thing I wanted to be a part of building than maybe most people do at 30 as a result of spending my entire 20s in the nonprofit world. The other thing, and you'll hear this said about good culture, is that cultures tend to be either missionary or mercenary. They tend to be either belief and value driven or reward driven. And certainly being a part of the nonprofit world helped me to build a much more belief and value driven culture in the companies that I would subsequently lead than I would have been able to do otherwise. So I actually think that I could not be the entrepreneur that I am today if I hadn't been in the nonprofit world and learned a lot of the things that I did in my 20s.
Man, I got to tell you, I had not thought of it before, but you've sold me. The idea that one of the biggest, I think, challenges young leaders have today is finding that purpose that they have, finding that inner drive that what are they working for that's bigger than selling whatever it is they're selling. And what a great way to get that dosing or get exposed to that is through a nonprofit. So I think you've sold me. You also mentioned the sales part. I speak to so many people that shy away from the word sales, and I think you and I would be strong proponents of the idea that I don't care if you're in finance or logistics on the line, you're selling every day. You may not be selling to a customer and making a pitch, but man, you are selling the quality of your product. You are selling the quality of your culture. If you're recruiting, you're trying to convince your shift leader that there's a better way to do this step of the process.
Right.
So man, Great points to kick us off, man. I appreciate that.
Well, and Steve, to add a point there, if you talk to the average college student today, one of the things that's great is that you will hear them say, I want to make a difference. I want to change the world with my career, with my life. You cannot change anything without changing people's minds, and that's persuasion. So sales can have, I think, a very businessy and a negative connotation. So we could just use the word persuasion. Learning to persuade people is going to be a key cornerstone of effectiveness if you want to do anything significant. If you want to change the world in any kind of meaningful way, you're going to have to be able to persuade people. And so, a startup is changing the world. It's like, well, people were just buying these things, and now I want them to change behavior and buy my thing instead of, or in addition to, the things that they're already buying. Well, that's going to take persuasion. Or I want people to think about this social issue or political issue differently. That's going to require persuasion. The thing that was great about being in the nonprofit world, if you think about the for-profit world, there's a lot of hierarchy, and it's like, hey, if you don't get in line with what the person a step above you in the hierarchy or two steps above you in the hierarchy says, then you can get fired, right? They can take away your job. So there's in the business world, the military would be this way. There's several different, kind of professions you can go into that work this way, where hierarchy matters a tremendous amount, and leadership can be much more positional, or at least can be viewed as much more positional. If you're the CEO, then the person who's, the customer support rep has to listen to what you say and has to do it, and you have positional leadership. The nonprofit world, because of the way it works, is mostly persuasion leadership. And it's not positional leadership. Like, I led a team when I was on staff with Crew. Everybody raised their salary. I didn't really have the ability to hire or fire people, right? And so all of my leadership had to be more persuasion leadership than positional leadership. The reason why I think this is significant is that a lot of leaders, where they struggle because the lowest common denominator of leadership is positional leadership. It's where I have a bigger title than you, and so you will do what I say you're going to do. And we've all in our life, we've all been tempted to play that card, whether it's our children or somebody at work. The reality is that's horribly ineffective leadership, and it actually makes people really resistant to the idea of allowing you to have influence and in their life, because they resent the kind of oppressiveness that can come with that. So when you learn to lead people through values and persuasion, then when you also have positional leadership, it is very easy for people to want to follow you. And it's much more, you're just much more effective. So that would be one recommendation I would give to anybody listening to this is, first, learn to lead from a persuasion values base. And through your career, as you gain positional leadership, you are going to find that you're an even more effective leader than you would have been otherwise.
Yeah, man, totally agree with you. And one of the things that I thought of as you were going through that is, you talked about college students, and if you could teach them one thing, it would be persuasion. I would say most college students that haven't experienced a leader, a values-led leader in the wild, in a company, probably think that positional leadership is leadership. Like they come out of college wanting to be the manager, and then wanting to be the VP, and wanting to be. And man, what a testament to the burden that we should all feel as leaders in today's companies, that we need to walk the talk and be that example of persuasive leadership, influential leadership, values-driven leadership, purposeful leadership, so that they get that exposure as early as possible. And a lot of colleges are doing a great job with that in organizations on campus and internship opportunities. So for sure. Hey, I would love to rewind the clock to the days where you were starting Simple Modern. I know you had I believe you had a co-founder with you on this journey. What role did culture play in your overall strategy? And it's I'm asking the question on purpose, because one of my theories is that when new companies start, a lot of them start by building a business. They have a business idea and they go out to build the business. And then a few years in, they ask the question, well, wait, what do we want our culture to be? And there are other organizations, and I would say Harvest Group is the one that's closest to my heart, that set out to build an organization that people wanted to work for and wanted to work for a higher purpose. And then the business opportunities were discovered by the top talent that you were able to attract to your mission and to your vision. I'm guessing Simple Modern was more like part two, or more like companies in that second group, but tell us what that was like right out of the gate.
So to give some context that'll help make the entire story make sense. While I was still in the ministry world, I helped my brother start a company, and that company got very big, very quick, like from founding to its first $1 million revenue day in 13 months. Wow. So it was the poster child for almost overnight success, technology-based company that can scale very rapidly. And as you can imagine, I was the oldest person associated with the company. I was not even full-time. I was doing this basically nights and weekends, and I was 31. And so it really fit the description of a company that grows very quickly. And a lot of the decisions are really like, how do we just keep this thing afloat? How do we do the stuff that needs to get done? And we tried to.
And none of us had done it before.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
None of us had done it
before.
before. Yeah.
And we tried to hire, and I think we did hire really good people, but the culture was very, I would say, accidental in how it developed. There wasn't the level of intentionality. I remember there was a point where this was before I was full time, where a survey was sent out to the employees of like, which of these values do you think would describe our company? And so like there was this attempt, I think, to think about culture in the right way, but it's also like if you get to the point where you're asking people, hey, what are our values? Then that kind of in some ways tells you like that if you're a 100-person organization and you're not telling people, hey, here's what we're about, but you're asking them, hey, what are we about? Then you've got that issue that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And going through the whole process at that company, it got up to 150 employees, I think, at one point. I eventually came on full time. I led a couple of departments that had, I would say, really healthy culture, but there were other subcultures that did not have healthy culture. In every organization, it's easy to think about like, well, what's the culture of your organization? Well, at a certain scale, there's lots of subcultures in your organization, and some are probably healthy and some aren't. But ours, the departments that I led, it had pretty healthy culture, and I have two co-founders. They both worked with me in one of those departments. And one of the ways that I knew we had really healthy culture in our department is other departments, when people would be on break, they would wander over to our office and just want to kind of hang out in our office. It was kind of a place that people wanted to go. So yeah, when we got the idea to start this, fundamentally, we knew we really enjoyed working with each other and the type of culture that had existed when we worked with each other previously. And we knew that we wanted to have a real focus on generosity. And that was, I would say, about it. That there was a high emphasis on like, we want to have values that really, a value set that really matters. We want to have great culture. We want to be generous. And then I would say we kind of launched with that and kind of had that thought process in mind, but kind of on pause. Like, hey, we're gonna hire great people that are about doing things the right way and generally share, our kind of undefined larger value set. And that persisted until we were about, I would say, 15 to 20 employees. And although I recruited really deliberately around this is the type of place that we want to build and casting vision around that, I did not do a good job of actually putting words to that. And so when we got to about 20 employees, we actually took the time to say, okay, let's actually write this down. Like, what are the values? Because we were in danger of doing the same exact thing over again. And one of the things that I say to people all the time, this is really my second crack at the piñata. And so a lot of the reason why I've been more effective in Simple Modern is because I went through the entire cycle with another company, the entire roller coaster, made a bunch of the mistakes, saw a bunch of the mistakes, And I've just been much more prepared for a second go round. But even with this, like, we didn't have these things as clearly defined as I would have liked to in the first, I would say, 2 years. We finally actually wrote it all down. And I don't think this was a situation where it was like we were kind of grasping for things. I think it was really more codifying what was already there. And I was honestly, I was a little bit skeptical that we needed to do that. Because I felt like, hey, everybody here kind of understands the environment we're trying to create. And it was, even in the early days, it was a special environment. It was just a poorly defined environment. There was, it was not very scalable, I think, looking back. Once we really wrote it down, then it started to be, I think, to use a term from my ministry days, transferable. So one of the big emphases we had in ministry was, you want to empower every person to be able to have impact in their life and in the lives of those around them, like talking about the Bible, for example. Well, it needs to be transferable in order for that to be possible. And so can you teach concepts to people in a way where they can take them and they can teach them to others? Culture is kind of like this. If you want to have really strong culture, you're going to have ownership across the organization. It's going to have to be transferable. It's not enough for me to be able to get up and give a great speech where everybody's excited about the idea, but nobody's able to really teach it clearly to their direct reports. Or it's like, well, Mike, we kind of need Mike to explain what that looks like. Instead, we want it to be so clear that anybody in the organization could stand up and say, well, this is what we're about, and here's what it looks like. So once we really codified it, that got a lot, I would say, it got a lot easier. And one of the things we started to do was every single person that gets hired, their first day, I sit down, I spend an hour going through the mission, vision, values with them. Over time, the first mission statement we came up with was actually not very good in retrospect. And we eventually shortened it to just, we exist to give generously. That's it. Because in the same way, going back to the transferable concept, the mistake that's easy to make is we're going to wordsmith this thing and it's going to end up being a 50-word sentence. And it's like, that's not helpful. Nobody can remember that. That's not going to drive behavior. But when you have a mission statement like, hey, we exist to give generously, two things. Number one, you can remember it, right? And it is distinctive and people know what you're about. And then it's easy for you to understand the implications of that and to think about the applications in your job and in the culture. So at this point, I would say we have incredibly high alignment organizationally around. You could ask anybody in the organization, they'd be able to tell you the mission statement, and they'd be able to tell you the 5 core values, and they'd be able to give you a description. I literally think you could go to anybody, even people working in our manufacturing facility, and I think that they could do that. So
I'm guessing they each have probably a story as well about where they've seen it play out. And not just when you told it from the stage, but they saw it.
That's right. Well, and that's part of why we do the one-on-one conversations when they first start, is that I want to be able to have an actual conversation with them. There's a lot of teaching there, but there's also like contextualizing it to the person, right? And helping them to really grasp it. The other thing that I do that's really key, that I think has been a big driver of culture, I was skeptical about our ability to maintain culture to 50, 75, 100 people. And we've done it much more effectively than I thought we would. In fact, I think what I've learned is it is possible for culture to get stronger at scale. It usually gets weaker. Usually what happens in organizations is that as they scale, the core doesn't hold, and it just becomes an unhelpful diversity around core values. And people are like, well, I'm part of this organization, but I don't really actually buy into this piece or whatever. And you really have problems when that happens. The opposite, though, can happen when your organization continues to scale with people who really own it and are really believers in whatever it is your core values are. It becomes this self-perpetuating flywheel where it is easier and easier for every person in the organization to buy in more deeply. And every additional person that comes in to the organization is another person that's now an advocate for your culture within the organization. So one of the ways that I say this to people whenever we do the mission, vision, values, at the very end, I'm like, here is the reality of our organization. We're now at 75, 80 people. I am now the minority. I'm like less than 2% of the interactions people will have at the company. The culture is not defined by me anymore. Like I can sit here, I can walk through it. I helped come up with this stuff, but I don't define the culture. You define the culture. The team defines the culture. Culture is like a garden. It only thrives if everybody picks the weeds, everybody waters the plants, everybody fertilizes the soil. I need you to own this with me together. I need us to both own this equally. And I know that's hard because I'm the CEO and I'm a co-founder, but like we have to all have that level of ownership if we're all going to get the benefit of being a part of a special culture. And what I've been thrilled with is that people have stepped up to that challenge. And one of the ways that I communicated, it took me, this is probably in the last year, I found this way to verbalize it, which is incredibly powerful. And I'll give an example. One of our values is generosity. Now, I have a commitment with my wife. We're going to give away virtually all of the money from this company over the course of our lifetimes. My co-founders share this commitment to generosity. Really, the entire ownership group does. So generosity is a really big part. We give 10% away annually. Like it's a big part of what we do. What I don't want people to hear when they come in the organization is, hey, we're about giving and you're going to see that this company's going to give money and I'm going to give money and the other owner's going to give money and we're about giving.
Yeah.
Instead, the way we define generosity is it's being open-handed with everything that you have for the benefit of other people. And when you define generosity that way, it turns out that every single person in the organization can be a leader in generosity. It will look different based on context and how people are situated. For someone else, for a customer support representative to be excellent at generosity and a leader in generosity is going to look different than for me. I mean, there'll be some overlap to be sure, but there's some things that they can do that I can't, some things that I can do that they can't. And so it's actually possible for every single person in our organization to say, yes, I help lead in generosity, and here's the particular way that I do it in our organization. And so it's not enough to just tell people, hey, I want you to own the culture. I want you to really care about it. I think what you have to do is take it a step further and say, whatever our company values, whatever our culture is that we're trying to create, not only can you help own it, but you can help lead in it regardless of position. So one of the ways we've done that with generosity is by helping people understand, like, you can be generous with your words. This is one of everybody can be generous with their words. And that can be affirmation, right? And appreciation. That can be teaching other people things that you learned, right? And being generous with your skills or whatever. But it's just an illustration of the fact that every single person in our organization can lead in generosity. And when everyone has that attitude, it's really powerful what happens when you've got 80 people that are like, I'm about generosity and I'm going to be a leader in generosity within the organization. So as we scaled, I've been surprised that I feel like the culture is probably strengthened. Another thing I say that I think maybe reinforces the point that I just made. My hope would be that if we got to a point where I was not willing to follow or submit to the values of the organization, that the organization wouldn't follow me. That's strong culture. Culture is so strong that no one's above it. There's no position. There's no title. You know, it doesn't matter if you're a founder. It doesn't matter how much ownership you have. That people will follow you based on the fact that you are bought into the values that everybody's signing up for. And if at some point you're like, yeah, I don't really want to do that, then people would vote with their feet and wouldn't want to follow you. So these are some of the ways that we've actually been deliberate in codifying it. We're taking the next step and using that to actually drive it being more deeply embedded in, the everyday life here.
Man, I love that. And you're right. That is a good test of the health and the strength of a culture is it's when it's no longer Mike's culture. And it doesn't hinge on Mike's behavior or Mike's decisions. It's simple modern. And if you've got a culture of being able to call people out when they see things that aren't necessarily aligned, man, that's incredible. I believe you're right. I think the single biggest challenge of fast growing, healthy cultures is the the fear of losing that as you scale. And you know, there's the whole idea of, you know, hey, we hire for culture fit. And I think that might work for the first 10 or 15 people. But to your point, every person that comes in the organization is bringing a new, unique spin on that culture. And I've tried to help my clients understand that it's not culture fit you're looking for, it's culture accretiveness. It's that they're aligned, values driven, they're aligned to your values, they're aligned to your mission, but they're going to bring their own unique spin to it. And that's how you remain healthy as you go beyond the 15 or 20 people that were around the conference table the first year. So man, I love that. Hey, I really want to dive into one area, which is really one of the reasons I was super excited to have you on, because this is a question I get a lot from founders of small, fast growing organizations. You made a decision, I think it was pretty early on, maybe it was 2016, 17, to bring Chris Hoyle in as a leader focused on culture. If I'm not mistaken, that was about the timing. And now you've got Jonathan. I believe Jonathan is currently in that role of kind of holding the mantle of being the shepherd. He's not the only one that owns it, clearly, but a shepherd for the culture. At what point did you know that I'm going to make this investment because it's important enough to me to have a leader at my leadership table that is focused on the culture of the organization?
Yeah.
At what point did that click for you?
And it's actually important to note that Chris actually joined the organization as our chief sales officer, and then we moved him into a role that was basically over hiring and culture. But like, the reason I would make that distinction is that he was very successful and his entire background was really in sales. But we got to a point where I really felt like the biggest value that he could drive to the organization would actually be in making sure that as we scaled the organization, that the culture was central. And John's been, I think John has hired 30 something people in the last year. So he's been another. I mean, it's a position that requires, I think, really high discernment. So part of the position is being a filter for helping find the right type of person. And I'm pretty unapologetic that, like, if you're going to try and build a great culture, like, you should be picky. I mean, there's 8 billion people in the world or whatever. We've got 75 here. So we can afford to be really picky, and we shouldn't be. One of the things we did with how we hired, whether it was myself hiring the first, I'd say I probably was in charge of the first 15 or 20 people. And then Chris and then John have both kind of done a stretch where they hired about 30 people. We really look for a track record of the culture that we are trying to create already being demonstrated and evident in that person's life. And I think that to piggyback on something you said earlier, at this point, our culture is very attractive to a lot of people, regardless of whether or not they're willing to put in the personal work to help be a part of establishing a culture like this. Who wouldn't want to be a part of an environment with, good boundaries and good work-life balance, where it's really encouraging and people are doing great? I mean, it's like, who wouldn't want to be a part of that? But are you willing to put in the personal work and the personal leadership and sacrifice it takes to create that? So we don't just look for people that are like, yeah, this is an exciting idea, your culture that you described, but we're actually looking for the fingerprint of, has this been a part of their life up until this point? Because,
that's awesome.
The way that we do interviewing and another big part of that is, listen, personal referrals matter a ton for us. It's virtually impossible to get hired at this organization if someone in the organization or someone that the organization trusts doesn't already know you. And in some ways, I'm sure that people could critique that in some ways. But again, we can only hire 75 or 80 people, and there's a ton of people out there. It's an incredibly effective filter for us, because what we're able to do is we're able to hire people that, like I said, have this track record of really demonstrating these qualities in their life already. So I do think culture can impact people. Like when you come into culture, like even for me, I helped create this culture and it impacts me and moves me around in positive directions. But it's even easier if you find people that are already committed and leading in these things and you bring them into an environment that fits. The other piece of that, and I think Chris and John have both done a really good job of this, is we lead with values. So we lead with this stuff in the recruitment process. And what it's become is really just a huge kind of magnet for a very certain type of person. Like our culture is probably not for everybody, but for the people that it's for, we increasingly have people that are like, I want to work there. If I can get in at that, it's not just like, oh, that's interesting, I want to interview there, but we'll have people that are like, I really just literally want to work at your company if there's any way I can get in the door. But I think that's on kind of the hiring front. Internally, what's been great about having both Chris and John in that role is we are very deliberate about, on a week-to-week basis, how do we continue to talk about, educate, emphasize culture with our entire team. And an example right now is like every Tuesday morning, we have an hour weekly, which is like a culture building time. Either I will teach about a value, or like today we did a new hire introduction with 4 new hires. We'll highlight different leaders in the organization talking about culture specific type of things. And so those are expensive meetings. I think I figured it up that, an hour meeting is almost a $5,000 meeting for us. So over the course of the year, we might invest.
Most expensive hour of your week, probably.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, we probably invest $250,000 just in those meetings every year, but it's a great investment. I think it's a great investment of company resources. So it's a key position. And I think one thing I could say to the entrepreneurs that are listening to this, the worst thing is to build a successful organization that you don't want to be a part of anymore. This happens to a lot of entrepreneurs. They think the game is, can I create a successful business? And they do all this work and you put in your pound of flesh or whatever. And then you don't even like working there because the culture is toxic or the people or, whatever. And this is what drives, honestly, a lot of the exits I see is that people are they build organizations that they don't actually really love. When people ask me about selling Simple Modern, I tell them I really have no plans of doing it. But one of the reasons why, and I had a student one time ask me, if somebody made you an offer you couldn't refuse, what would you do? And I just told them, I think that implies that there is a number or an amount of money where I would just say, oh, of course I would trade for that. And I just don't know that that's true. I think there are some things in life that are really priceless. And I think if you think about in your own personal life, the experiences you've had, there are some experiences that you would not trade for anything. And when you're a part of really healthy culture, you don't want to trade that for anything. There's not an amount of money, because if you got a whole bunch of money, you just spend all that money trying to get back to the feeling that you already have. And so I actually think for me and for my quality of life at this point in the company, one of the ways that I stay the most engaged and that my quality of life stays the highest is when we really emphasize the culture. So we've invested really heavily in it, in the type of leaders that we put in the position. And I do think it's, I guess to emphasize this, we were probably at about 20 employees and 20 or 30 million in revenue before we really felt like we could have somebody full-time focusing on this. So it was kind of an all play up until that point. But yeah, we've been really deliberate in before we had that position in trying to make sure everybody knew the type of culture we're trying to create. And then especially as we've scaled, we've invested a lot of resources and top leadership into making sure that we kept that a focus.
Man, that's great. The theory I like to share with leaders or founders that I'm talking with is, and it sounds like through your experience at Simple Modern and mine at Harvest, the 20 to 25 teammate threshold is about the time when leaders that fully understand the value of culture will invest in a full-time resource that's focused. And I would argue that 50 is late. And somewhere in that 25 to 50 range, that is a critical window for a company to look at the P&L, to look at the organizational strategy and say, you know what, this year we're gonna prioritize hiring or bringing in or elevating a person that's in the organization. And kudos to you for sliding Chris over from leading sales into the role. Clearly he knew the culture like the back of his hand, and he had the respect of the organization because he knew the business. And that's brilliant, man. I love that. And I hope that my clients that are listening will see you being affirming of what I've been saying for a few months with them is, man, it is really important to figure out when in the life cycle of your company you can make this kind of investment. And I would argue that it's 25 to 50-ish. And you probably got to have a really unique scenario if you get beyond 50 and you can continue to grow in a healthy way without having someone, fully dedicated.
Well, and a principle there is we've always used somebody internal. I think the bigger you get, the later you go and the bigger you get before you actually try and put somebody in this role, the more critical is that it's an internal hire. Mm-hmm. And that it's somebody who really everybody looks to as a natural keeper of the culture already. Like if you're at 20 people, I think you can go outside and bring somebody in. Mm-hmm. If you're at 60 people and you try and do that and bring somebody in that's going to now come in here and tell people what the culture is, it's like, it just doesn't even make any sense.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think you're right. Earlier.
That's a great point, Mike. That's a great point. Hey, I know I've already seen a couple questions hit. Jacob, if you wouldn't mind, blow out chat for me first, maybe, or maybe blow them both out if you can. Mike, while we're getting ready to kind of take some questions from folks, I always like to ask everybody on this conversation a question that's near and dear to my heart because I just love music and think that it has a role to play in our happiness at work and in connecting with folks and connecting with companies. So, and I did warn you that this question was coming, so hopefully you had a minute to think about it. But if you could think of a song that you think captures the heart and the energy of the simple modern culture, what song would you put on the playlist?
So I struggle with this a little bit because really, like, there's a lot of songs that remind me of just seasons of the company's growth and have become kind of emblematic of that period for me. I think that, like I could probably give a lot of different answers. Like the movie The Greatest Showman came out at one point and a point in our growth, and it's kind of a movie about entrepreneurship. And I'm like, so like I hear some of that music and it's easy for me to kind of get back into like that frame of mind. So I didn't have one in particular, which is kind of rare for me. Usually I'm like, oh, it's this. It's more that in different seasons there have been different songs, but I think that for sure the kind of stuff that resonates, whether it's songs or books, it's stories of people that are willing to really take on big things and to dream big. And that's the stuff that resonates with me. Because I've read a lot of biographies as I've led the company, like Hamilton was one. I read the churn out biography of Hamilton and saw the play. And so there's some songs in there. There's a lot of different pieces of literature and music that throughout the journey, I think have served as inspiration, but it's mostly been around the idea that it's hard. It's hard to lead. It's hard to create something. And I've always been encouraged, whether it's in music or in word, by the stories of other people that have done it and the struggles that come with it. And so those are the things that always resonate with me. And like I said, it's like, right now my answer I'd give today would probably be different than the answer I'd give in a couple of years, but I'm a big believer that as a leader, drawing on inspiration from things like that's actually really helpful. Yeah.
No, I love the idea of seasons. That's really impactful for me personally, Mike. Harvest also had a team meeting every Tuesday morning for an hour, similar to what you guys do. And a big part of me that I brought to that meeting was we would always have a song playing to kick off the meeting. And I cherished that playlist because I put them all in a playlist. There's almost 300 songs that tell a story of whatever was going on, about that time in our history or about the leader that was individually leading that day. I asked them to pick a song that they'd like me to play. And so, man, I love the idea that it's about, there's there's certainly seasonal milestones or seasonal gates and songs that would resonate. I'm going to look over at the Q&A and the chat. Matt, can you also, if you see a question in the Q&A or the chat, Matt, that you definitely want to hit, would you chime in with that?
Absolutely. First of all, while we're digging through this, I appreciate as an entrepreneur so much about what you said about falling out of love with your own company. I have been an entrepreneur for 18 years, and that really, really resonates with me. So thank you for saying that. So one of the questions here is being able to tell a story, persuasion is vital for leadership. How would you suggest that people can develop their storytelling skills?
Yeah, I think that's great. So a few things. One is you're just going to have to practice. The reality with developing skill at anything is repetition and practice. We talk about this all the time in the company, that the way that you get good at anything is by having a bias to action and doing things imperfectly and gradually getting better through iterative improvement. And certainly my ability to tell stories and as a spokesperson has developed as I've done it more. I think fundamentally what I have done a lot of over the last 20 years, really, this even goes back to my time in ministry, is I see themes that are worth talking about. And then I have kind of in the back of my head, I have kind of an antenna that's constantly looking for things that will nest into those themes, stories that nest into those themes. So let me give an example. I want to communicate to our team that although what we're doing is not, we're not building rockets, we're not, creating world peace, but what we are doing is meaningful. We can feel good about
You're
the way
making
that
some
we're
really
investing.
great drinkware.
We're making great drinkware, and we're able to give. And so I'm constantly looking for, well, what are stories that I can tell that help show the dignity of the work that we do and the meaning of the work that we do. And I'll give an example of one that I tell. I teach at OU. I'm the entrepreneur in residence at OU, and I teach basically the capstone if you're an entrepreneurship student. For several years, I had a co-teacher named Denise Paris, who's a friend of mine, and she lost her mother when she was young and had a very close relationship with her father. During COVID, she left Norman and her and her husband went to stay with her father in Florida, and found out that her father had been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. I can't remember what type, but it's very serious diagnosis. So I would touch base with her from time to time, and I touched base with her 1 week somewhere in the COVID haze, and she said, "Yeah, my dad passed away." But she said, "I wanted to thank you because in the last couple of weeks, he couldn't drink from a regular cup. And we kept looking for a solution. And the only thing we found that worked is one of your kids' water bottles with this straw lid from Target. He could drink from that. And that water bottle in his last couple of weeks of his life actually brought a lot of relief to him. And so I just want you to know I appreciated it. I'm thankful for that." And I share that story with my team, right? That when you do your job with excellence, you're impacting people's lives, a lot of people's, in our case, millions of people, tens of millions of people's lives in a positive way. And it's impossible for us to know all those little stories, but it matters. It matters to do your job with excellence. And when we do our job with excellence, a city in Uganda gets access to clean drinking water as a result of some of the giving that we're able to do. And that matters. And we don't see those things. They're intangible because we don't see them and we don't hear many of those stories, but it doesn't mean that they're not real. So it's an example, right? That when she said that to me, I'm like, oh man, that's a really good illustration of a principle that I want to communicate to my team. And so I constantly have my antenna up. This is also, I read a lot of biographies. I want to be a continuous learner. And as I am a continuous learner, that really helps me to be able to tell more stories. You can't impart what you don't possess. And so as a leader, if you are stagnant and you're not bringing in new information, it's going to be difficult for you to tell new and compelling stories that communicate the points that you want to communicate. But when you are taking the responsibility to be a self-feeder and you're continually learning, what you'll find is that there are a lot of opportunities actually to communicate the core things that you want to communicate in new and fresh and relevant ways.
Man, I love that visual of the idea of keeping your antenna up, and how impactful that must be for your team, that on a random Tuesday meeting, you share a story that happened in a conversation the day before, the week before.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's the kind of stuff that reinforces culture, because it's happening in the moment, it's relevant. And if you didn't have your antenna up, always looking for those kinds of things, man, you'd miss those opportunities.
Right.
Speaking of you having your antenna up and you being a learner, I want to say to the folks that are watching this, if you do not follow Mike Beckham on Twitter, you are missing a masterclass in entrepreneurship. Man, I have loved following what I'm seeing on your Twitter feed is your antenna's up, you hear something, you see something, you discover something, and then you write about it. And the knowledge and the nuggets of wisdom that I've gotten from your Twitter feed over the last couple of years is just really, really impactful. So thank you for that. And for folks that are watching, you have to go follow him if you're not already.
Well,
hey,
to double click on an idea from earlier, because I think in you and I's back and forth leading up to the show, one of the things you mentioned is like, hey, what was the motivation? And I think this is actually an example that you can kind of tie several concepts together. When we talk about generosity in the company and we talk about it being open-handed with everything you have, one of the ways that plays out is I don't want the company to get the perception that my idea of generosity is I write checks. I want to be open-handed with my time. I want to be open-handed with the things that I'm learning and the skills and the experience and all of that for the benefit of other people. And that's really the answer to the social media thing. It's an example of me actually living out the company culture. Does it cost me time? Yes. Is it sometimes, something I'd rather not do? Yes. But I know that it provides benefit for other people. And it's an example of me being able to push myself in generosity in a way that's not easy. I mean, writing a check is really fairly easy for me on the spectrum of things to do. Being deliberate and spending an hour thinking about how do I communicate something that could help somebody else to be more effective, but is going to cost me an hour of my time right now. That's actually more costly. That takes more generosity from me at this point. And so it's just an illustration of the same idea that when the company sees that and they see like, okay, he's being thoughtful about how do I apply generosity, not just when it comes to my money, but just my time and everything else, then I think it has a really positive effect. And what's actually happened is several other people in the company have started to invest in doing the same thing and sharing some of the things they're learning. And as a result, our company is able to make, more of a positive impact.
Yeah. Man, to put that in the context of generosity was really helpful. I will tell you, I was surprised when you went down your thread a few months ago about winning at Amazon and what you've learned specifically about how to compete with Amazon. So listen to this. You've got the guy who the company that currently sells more drinkware than Yeti and Stanley, or Yeti and Hydro Flask on Amazon, putting in the Twitter sphere all of the lessons he's learned about winning at Amazon. If that's not being generous with knowledge and with experiences, man, I don't know what is. So that's a great example, Mike. I appreciate you sharing that. There's a question in here from Jim. It looks like when you were staffing up that role, first with Chris and then with John, was there a particular skill that you looked for in an internal candidate that gave you confidence that they were the right one? Is there a particular skill set or experience set?
It's a great question. There's two things I'd say. One is that they were naturally viewed as a leader in the culture and that they have a really great discernment, because ultimately that person is the number one gatekeeper of who gets in the company, and that disproportionately shapes culture. So it was really important that you put somebody in there where everybody's going to say, hey, you can kind of say, if everybody lived out the culture the way that person does, how would we feel about the organization? And for sure, both Chris and John represent the culture in a way where you would love it. You'd love it if everybody was watching them and saying, man, I want to model the way that I do it off of them. And then just really high wisdom discernment about choosing the right people to add to the team to make sure that the culture continues to be strong.
Yeah, man, that's awesome. Mike, I can't believe that we are out of time. Days like this, I wish this was a 90-minute or one of those marathon podcasts that are out there today. But man, for those of you that are listening and watching, and if you're hearing Mike for the first time, I would encourage you to follow him on Twitter, first of all. Second of all, do a quick search in your Apple Podcasts and search his name and search for shows. And you're going to find some discussions just like this, because he's very generous with his time. And third thing I would say is, we didn't get a chance to talk about this, Mike. Mike did a limited edition podcast series called Scaling for Good back in the fall. And it was 5 or 6 episodes. And man, it is a treasure trove of how do you think about launching and scaling a values-driven company. So hopefully those are all things that you'll get a chance to do, listeners and viewers out there. Mike, anything you'd like to share before we sign off?
Appreciate you having me on here. The biggest thing that I want to share about Simple Modern and just the concepts that I'm sharing is that first of all, Simple Modern, I would never want to position it as like we've got it all figured out. We have a particular way that we're approaching this stuff that I think's worked for us. It's not the only way, it's not the right way. And I think every leader has to find their own kind of manifestation of how this stuff works. And the second thing I would say is, for anybody listening, do not get intimidated by my ability to articulate some of these things. Sometimes it's a lot easier to articulate things than it is to actually live them out. What really matters is how you live them out. And it's a progressive process. You know, like at this point, I'm probably like 13 years or so into leading companies, and it's a gradual process. What I have found matters the most is what are the internal thought processes that somebody has, and what's the deliberateness that they're applying to put these things in action, and that compounds really nicely over time. So what I want to be a helpful resource to people. The last thing I want to do is be up on a pedestal or be an intimidating idea to people of like, okay, that feels unattainable, or that feels like, you know, we're not there. If you're a leader, there are ways that you can take some of these concepts, you can start to apply them right now, and gradually over time, you'll be amazed at what it turns into.
That's why we love you, Mike. You bring that humility to your leadership there and your willingness to share it. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We have these conversations on leadership and culture every few weeks, and be sure to tune in next time where we'll continue the conversation with influential leaders that are leading in thriving organizations with healthy cultures, and sharing some of that wisdom with you here. Be sure to head over to Conversations on Retail's homepage. You can find all kinds of great conversations that are relevant to the CPG space and the retail market environment. So head on over there and get some knowledge.